Greetings and salutations. Welcome to a video about audio. Today we're going to talk about CD audio preemphasis. What is it and why should you care about it? Those who watch this video will fall into two categories. The first category are those of you who have never heard of such a thing and clicked on it because you were curious. I will tell you exactly what this is all about very shortly. And the second category of person who's watching this video is either an engineer or a hobbyist who already understands this and wants to see what I have to say about it. If you fall into that second category and you would like to add your feedback, please do in the comments. Plus, if I get anything wrong, feel free to correct me. When you go to look this up in textbooks about CDs, and yes, I actually have some of those, I am that big of a nerd, this gets a paragraph. It's like they just throw it in there and they move on and they don't get into the whys and the wherefores and they don't explain it very well. So hopefully in this video I'll be able to do that. Now the only thing that's going to be on the screen is pictures, guys, like the drawing that you have here, or the figure that shows the preemphasis curve for the CD. But I also want to talk about the CD player that has inspired me to post this video. That's coming up later on. So exactly what is preemphasis? Well, quite simply, it is a way of recording audio to a medium. And it doesn't matter what that medium is. It could be like analog discs, like records, vinyl records. They use preemphasis, a very specific kind of preemphasis called the RIAA curve. That has been the standard since stereo LPs came along. So you have to have a phono preamplifier not only to boost the low output from a phono cartridge, but also to apply the proper compensation for the preemphasis curve. That's also called EQ. This is also known as a recording characteristic curve. So you'll come across all those kinds of things. There was a YouTuber that I was watching not too long ago who has a pretty big channel, and he talks about all things audio. He will remain nameless, who was talking about a phono preamplifier, the kind that you need if you want to send your turntable to a receiver or an amplifier that doesn't have one built in. And in the specifications it said something about proper EQ, and he didn't know what it was. So apparently he didn't understand what preemphasis was. Maybe he'll see this video. I doubt it. So when you're talking about disc recording, as in analog discs, and you're talking about tape recording, it uses some form of preemphasis where the high frequencies are boosted and then attenuated or turned down on playback, and that's done to a very specific standard. And we're not talking about the kind of EQ where you know, like a graphic equalizer, you're thinking about that. This is very precise, and it's usually measured with a time constant, which they don't have anywhere listed for what the CD preemphasis is, but I'm sure somebody out there knows it. I have just not come across it. Basically, the CD preemphasis curve is, it's flat all the way up until 1 kilohertz, and then after that it rises to 10 dB boost at 20 kilohertz. And then, of course, on playback, you have to turn that back down. As I mentioned, this is also something that's done with tape, and it depends on the speed of the tape. There are different curves for different speeds, all kinds of stuff to keep up with, which is one of the reasons that tape recorders are a pain in the ass to deal with, is because this is part of what you have to keep up with. It's not just a physical alignment, but it's an electronic alignment that you have to do on tape recorders, and it gets to be a problem. Now, when the CD standard was introduced in the early 80s, 1982 was the official release date for the CD. When they were working on that in the late 70s and early 80s, this would have been the engineers at Sony and Philips, somebody must have stood up and said, hey, we need to have a provision for preemphasis in the recording of digital audio for a CD. Why they came up with this, I'm not really sure. Because digital audio in and of itself is very clean. Whereas when we talk about playing back discs, as in records, not discs as in CDs or tapes, you're always fighting noise. There's a lot of noise in the analog world. With tapes, there's tape hiss. With records, there's pops and clicks and surface noise. So that's part of the reason why it's done. Although on records, they're doing this preemphasis to be able to put a very wide band of frequencies in the groove. So on a record, they actually reduce the bass and boost the highs. And that's just so you can fit all those frequencies in one little micro groove. But with a CD, with digital audio, none of that applies. You don't have this tremendous noise floor to worry about. But I guess it could be said that for certain classical recordings, this would be a benefit. It would definitely increase the resolution of the high frequencies. And that depends on how it would be de-emphasized. In other words, if you had a CD player that had the de-emphasis circuits that were analog, yeah, I could see that. But if they were digitally de-emphasizing this, I think that you would lose all that resolution because you're just pushing it right back down. But anyway, nonetheless, this is how it's done. Early CDs, and we're talking 83, 84, this is when commercial CDs came out. Some of them do have preemphasis. I own 4 that I know of. And I want to talk a little bit more about that toward the end of the video, because if anybody else knows of any more, please tell me. If you know that you have a CD with preemphasis, put it in the comments, and we'll talk about why a little bit later on. So, if you have a CD with preemphasis, it's pretty much seamless. You put the CD in the machine catches a flag in the data that says, hey, this is preemphasized audio, and it kicks in the proper de-emphasis circuit, and it plays it back no problem. One website that I was looking at when researching for this video said that the preemphasis flag was on the disc and not on the track. That is not true. The preemphasis flag is on the disc and the track, or it's on the disc but not on the track, or it's on the track but not on the disc itself. And if that didn't make sense here, let me explain. So when you put the CD in, and in the table of contents, that data that's loaded that tells it where all the tracks are and all that stuff. And of course later on they added where you got CD text and all that stuff. But the original, just telling you where the tracks were and what times they were and all that stuff, you could have a preemphasis flag there, which would basically give the CD player a heads up going, hey, this is all preemphasized. But on each individual track, they can be preemphasized as well. So at the beginning of the track in the audio stream, there's a preemphasis flag that will turn preemphasis on and then turn it off when the track is over. I know this because I have a test CD, and that test CD has a track on it that is preemphasized right next to a track that isn't, that has white noise, so that you can compare an A-B for your player to see how well the compensation circuits work, the actual de-emphasis circuits. So that's how I know that for sure. And if you want to find that test CD and look that up for yourself, it's called The Digital Domain. If you do a search for that, you'll find it. And that disc has helped me to diagnose the issue that we need to discuss concerning preemphasis, because up to now, you're probably saying to yourself, well, why do I even care about this? If the CD player automatically figures this out, compensates for it, and the sound that comes out is good, why should I care? Because when they put all this crap together in the system, they never anticipated that 20, 30, 40 years later, we would be taking these CDs and trying to rip audio from them and turn them into MP3 files, WAV files, FLAC files for storage on a hard drive. That just never entered anybody's mind at that time. And most CD drives will not compensate for the preemphasis on the disc. So if I rip a CD and the CD is preemphasized, the audio that I get when I listen to it is going to be very bright sounding because we have this preemphasis here. Okay? There's a preemphasis that you can see. That preemphasis has to be reduced, or else everything sounds very trebly. And it's kind of the opposite of that song, all about that bass. It becomes all about that treble. So how do you do that? Well, iTunes, early versions of iTunes supposedly figured this out. The drive apparently passes the preemphasis on somehow or another to the software, and it knew that it was doing it. It didn't de-emphasize it, but it said, hey, this is pre-emphasized audio. And it would pick up on it, and it would do it in the software, and then once you would make your whatever file it was that you were making, MP3s or whatever, it would be proper. But all of the other software that I have ever used to rip audio from a CD ignores it. And that would be Audio Grabber, Exact Audio Copy. Right now I'm using Sound Juicer. All of the rippers that I've seen in Linux, they don't compensate for this. I remember when I did my big long video about ripping CDs, which I'll put in the description here because it was a mammoth work. It runs over an hour. It was actually in my notes to talk about preemphasis, but I never got there. It just didn't get included, and I figured, well, there are so few CDs floating around with preemphasis that we won't even talk about it, and it'll be okay. So the way I deal with it is this. I have put into Audacity a preset in the Filter Curve EQ effect plugin, and this turns this back down by the pre-described rate that you see in this particular, we'll get to that in a second, but see here, you'll see the preemphasis at recording, it goes up and then it comes back down. Well, this is the down. So I can take the audio that comes off a preemphasized CD and I run it through this, and then we go back to flat. And I have 4 CDs that have preemphasis. That's what I've got about 20, maybe I want to say about 2,500 CDs total in my collection. Out of that, I've found 4 so far. So that's basically what preemphasis is. The rest of this video is going to be me talking about why I decided to go ahead and do this video now. I got a CD player that blew my mind, and it was the reason why I did this video, because it actually has a light on the display that tells you whether a CD has preemphasis or not. This is a Denon CD 810. I picked it up on eBay, refurbished, and this is actually the picture that the eBay seller took of the machine, because I can't get a good shot of it right now. It's actually sitting on the floor under my equipment rack because I don't have any other place to put it, and I have been listening to everything through this thing for the last 2 or 3 days, from everything from classical to hip-hop. I've been listening to jazz and rock and all kinds of stuff, and country and whatever I could throw at it, because this is one of the best-sounding standalone CD players I've ever heard. And it comes from around 1990. According to what I read online, this particular model was introduced in 1989. I'm thinking mine was probably built sometime in the early 90s. This is part of a series of players that Denon put out about that time. Here is the this is the online money shot of it from another web page that had a picture of it, and this one is much easier to see. It's so difficult to take a picture of a black piece of equipment. Now, this CD player, as I said, has a light on the display where, if you look down here, let me get my mouse so you can see right there, there's an emphasis light. And so if you put a CD in that is pre-emphasized, it plays it. Or it shows it. And I knew I had 2 for sure that had pre-emphasis, and that was Men at Work Cargo. And I have an original 1983 pressing of that. And the other one was Can't Slow Down by Lionel Richie, also from 1983. As I said, this is very prevalent on early CDs. But then just playing stuff in my collection, I also found that I have the Andreas Vollenweider in the garden, behind the wall, under the tree. That was recorded with Preemphasis. Now, that is kind of like new age, weird harp music, jazz stuff. I don't know what you call that stuff. So it kind of makes sense. I mean, it's kind of very airy, and there's a lot of high frequencies in it. So that's probably why they chose to do that. And then the other one that I found was Bob Dylan's Greatest Hits, which is one of the early Columbia CDs. But curiously enough, mine is a reissue from 1999. I looked it up. And so what they did was basically took that original tape that they had put together of Bob Dylan's Greatest Hits in the very early 80s when they were doing the first run of CDs, and they just reissued it exactly the way it was because the Preemphasis flags are all on the disc. And so fortunately, I had not done anything from Andreas Vollenweider. I didn't rip that into my computer. It's not something I want to listen to every day. But I had put Bob Dylan in there, so I went back and redid that and used the Audacity filter curve EQ preset to put that back to normal, and now that sounds right. I do remember hearing that those Bob Dylan tracks that I had put in from that disc, and you got to remember, this is something that I did 20-something years ago, kids. Long time ago. And I have noticed that as I've heard those through the years played back on the computer that they've been a little bright. But I thought that's just the way the CD was. They made a lot of CDs that had a lot of high frequencies on them because they could push it, you know. But now that I have the proper de-emphasis on, it sounds the way it should. By the way, if you have any CDs that you know for sure have Preemphasis on them, I don't know if I mentioned this already in this video. If I did and I'm repeating myself, my apologies. Tell me about it in the comments. Tell me that you have it. Tell me the title and artist, please. There is online somewhere a list of pre-emphasized CDs. It's wrong. Only a few of them are right. Some of them are people, they think they're pre-emphasized. Like, for instance, they're thinking that the original 1985 Dire Straits Brothers in Arms CD, that first pressing, was pre-emphasized. According to my machine, it's not. And what they're saying is, well, they pre-emphasized it and then didn't put the flag on it. I don't know. Maybe they just had a lot of high frequencies on that disc. That, for me, does not sound like pre-emphasized audio. Pre-emphasized audio, those high frequencies are painful on certain material. So if you know of any more, if you have one in your collection, please tell me about it. Just out of curiosity, I'd like to know how many of these there are actually out there. I do know that there's more classical pre-emphasized CDs than pop music, and I do know that some of the very first editions of pop records have pre-emphasized audio on there. It's a hard word to say repeatedly. And one is, I was looking at this original Japanese pressing of She's So Unusual by Cyndi Lauper, and they said it was pre-emphasized. But this was a very early pressing in Japan alone. It might have been even before CDs were officially announced. Because they did do a few pressings that were just sort of like for demonstration purposes, and every now and again one of those will come up. By the way, the first CD to ever be issued commercially was Billy Joel's 52nd Street. There's no pre-emphasis on that disc. Or at least on the slightly later edition. I know I don't have the original Japanese edition of that one, but I do have a very early one, and there's no pre-emphasis. So none of the Billy Joels have pre-emphasis early on that I can tell. I bought a bunch of those. And so finally, I guess the thing... well, before I get into that wrap-up, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the way this CD player sounds, because it's opened up a lot of doors, which is one of the reasons why I'm hoping that if you're a hobbyist or an engineer that you're still listening. This CD player, I'm not sure whether you would consider this to be a first or second generation CD player. I think it's a second generation CD player because they're using two DACs, one for the right, one for the left, 4 times oversampling, and as far as I know, this machine has the traditional resistor ladder DAC. This is not a 1-bit DAC. where you take pulse code modulation and turn that into pulse width modulation. When you hear about a 1-bit DAC, that's what that's doing, is you're taking the pulse code modulation and mathematically you're just changing that to on and off. And you're turning it on and off so fast that it can actually represent an audio curve. Laser discs used pulse width modulation to encode the signal on them. And they were considered to be analog. This was not digital. When CD came along, they used digital audio, and then they had so you have to have an analog to digital converter, and then you have to have a digital to analog converter. And the digital to analog converter of that day, of the early 80s, was a single resistor ladder thing that you fed the number to, and it would put out the proper voltage for each sample, and there was a sample and hold circuit, which basically just kind of set the voltage, and then that voltage was sent on to an amplifier, and that's how it worked. With 1-bit, you, like I said, convert PCM to pulse width modulation. That came along a little bit later. And one of the reasons that the entire industry moved to 1-bit DACs, and we're talking about like Technique's MASH or the Sony Super Linear DAC that came along a little bit later on. Why they did that was because it was easy to produce that kind of DAC, whereas with a resistor ladder DAC, they need to be calibrated. The least significant bit and the most significant bit need to be calibrated. And if you open up early CD players next to the DAC, you may even see a little trimmer, because they apparently would put a test disc in there and they would trim that up in the factory. Well, this is costly and time consuming. With this particular CD player, the Denon CD 810, what they did was they put 2 DACs in it. And the reason why they did that was, with 1 DAC, the way it works with CD, or originally the way it worked is that it would decode a frame of left channel audio, then do the right, then the left, then the right, then the left, then the right, then the left, and then this would all be synced up later on when it was sent out to the amplifier. And the early machines weren't incredibly good at switching back and forth, and there would be a phase delay between the channels, which kind of messed with the stereo imaging somewhat. Most people couldn't hear it, and it was something that you could measure, but I don't think you could hear. I mean, you can have fun debating that if you want to. By the time this CD player came along, Denon decided the way they were going to deal with it was just simply put 2 DACs in it. So the data for the left channel audio and the data for the right channel audio is split up. And one goes to one DAC and one goes to the other, and they're hooked to separate amplifiers on the output, and that's your right and left channel. I can tell you that with this particular machine, this is the best stereo I've ever heard a CD player do. I'm talking about a standalone CD player. We're not sending it into a bigger DAC. We're not talking about a modern DAC, which usually is a combination of resistor ladder and 1-bit and all this crazy stuff they do these days. This is a traditional standalone CD player that does not have a digital output on it, which is one of the reasons I was able to get it cheap. I bought it cheap because this particular model, it didn't have the optical out, which is what most people are looking for these days, because the trend now is to take your CD player or your DVD player or whatever and hook that into a DAC to play back your CDs. I'm not quite there yet. Maybe somewhere down the road I'll set myself up with that sort of system, but I do have a Tascam. I have a Tascam CD recorder that has a very nice AKM DAC in it. It's a 24-bit DAC. So I can take the output, let's say, from my Sony. Now that's definitely a second or third generation CD player with a 1-bit DAC. I can take that output audio and put it into the Tascam. And if I do that, then it definitely sounds better than what comes straight out of the Sony. The 1-bit DACs, to me, always sounded kind of metallic, especially on the bass. If you had an album that had a lot of bass in it and they were really trying to push it, something about that in my ears sounded like it was a metallic sound. It's the best way that I can put it. I hear it a little bit with the Sony. I have a Sony that has a what they call a super linear 1-bit DAC or whatever they call that. And then with the old Technics CD players from the 90s, the MASH players, they sounded very, very good. But they also had that trace of that metallic sound in the bass. And I don't hear that at all with this CD player. Now, I do not hear that with my Tascam that has the AKM DAC in it. Okay, that's a modern DAC. But the Tascam has great stereo, but it doesn't have a lot of snap. It's like, it's there, it's great, it sounds good, it's nice, but it's almost muted is not the word that I want to use, and it certainly isn't muddy, but it's not. You just don't get the sparkle. There's no sheen. This CD player, the Denon, has this tremendous flat response with a nice, healthy, funky bass, extremely clean highs, and the resolution on this thing is amazing. It sounds like 24-bit digital coming off CDs that were recorded in the 80s. It's just, I have some jazz CDs that were just amazing sounding on this thing. Just wow. So I'm really enjoying it. And anytime that you get a piece of equipment that teaches you something or illuminates something, it always is very cool. And this is definitely one of them situations, because essentially what I want to go through is all of my commercial CDs and at least play one track off of them to see whether it's pre-emphasized on this particular machine. So probably should have done a separate video about it, but does anybody really want to see a separate video about a CD player from 1990? I don't think so. So anyhow, that's my video about Preemphasis, everything that you should ever really need to know about it when it comes to CDs. Like I said, you can go and just find one of these curves right here. You can screenshot this if you want to, because it's accurate. And then you can go in here and reconstruct this curve if you need to. It seems to work very well. Actually, I found this preset online, so if you do a search for it, you might be able to find originally where I found it, which I couldn't do for the video, because I thought it would be cool to put a link down in the description, and I couldn't find it. So if you study this carefully, you should be able to recreate it and then create a preset of your own to deal with Preemphasis on CDs. So that's it, gang. Thank you for watching. I certainly do appreciate it. I hope you found this to be informative. Like I said, if you know more than I do, if you're a hobbyist, if you're that kind of person that's taking an old CD player and then hooking vacuum tubes directly out of the outputs of the DAC to act as amplifier buffers and crazy stuff like that, please comment. You guys, I think that's cool. Thank you for watching. We'll do this again soon.